A 12-year-old boy sat quietly in seat 2B, first class, reading a book about astronomy. Within minutes, a white passenger leaned over and whispered words that would change everything. "Boy, you need to move to the back where you belong." The child looked up, calm as still water, and simply said, "My ticket says 2B." What the passenger didn't know was that the boy's mother wasn't just wealthy, she owned the airline. And she was about to board that very plane. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 as 12-year-old Marcus Thompson adjusted his navy blazer and checked his boarding pass one final time. Flight 847 to Los Angeles, seat 2B, first class. His grandmother had always told him to dress well when traveling, and today he wore her advice like armor. Crisp white shirt, perfectly knotted tie, and polished black dress shoes that reflected the terminal's gleaming floor. Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of a child who had been taught that respect was earned through character, not demanded through volume. His messenger bag contained 3 books, a tablet loaded with educational apps, and a handwritten letter from his science teacher recommending him for the National Young Astronomers Program. At 12, Marcus had already built 2 telescopes from scratch and could name every constellation visible from Chicago's light-polluted sky. The boarding announcement echoed through the gate area as Marcus joined the priority boarding line. He presented his ticket to the gate agent with the polite smile his mother had taught him, the same smile that had charmed teachers, librarians, and neighbors throughout his young life. The agent scanned his pass without a second glance, and Marcus walked down the jet bridge with the measured steps of someone who belonged exactly where he was. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a study in understated luxury. Cream leather seats, polished wood accents, and the soft hum of air conditioning created an atmosphere of refined comfort. Marcus found seat 2B, a window seat on the right side of the aircraft, and settled in with the practiced ease of a frequent traveler. He carefully placed his bag in the overhead compartment, buckled his seatbelt, and opened his astronomy book to a chapter about black holes. The seat beside him, 2A, remained empty as other passengers filed into the cabin. Marcus watched through his window as ground crews prepared the aircraft, their choreographed movements as fascinating to him as the celestial mechanics he studied in his books. He pulled out a small notebook and began sketching the wing design, wondering about the physics that would soon lift them 35,000 feet into the sky. "Excuse me, son." The voice came from behind him, sharp and nasal with the particular edge that indicated its owner expected immediate compliance. Marcus turned to see a man in his 50s standing in the aisle. Robert Cunningham was everything central casting would order for an entitled businessman. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit slightly wrinkled from travel, and the kind of pale complexion that suggested most of his time was spent in boardrooms rather than outdoors. Cunningham's eyes swept over Marcus with the calculating assessment of someone cataloging everything that seemed out of place. The boy's youth, his race, his presence in first class, all seemed to register as anomalies requiring correction. Behind Cunningham, other passengers were backing up in the aisle, waiting for him to take his seat in 3A, but he seemed in no hurry to move. "I think there might be some confusion about your seat," Cunningham continued, his voice carrying the false courtesy that adults often used when addressing children they intended to dismiss. "First class is pretty expensive. Are you sure you're not supposed to be back in coach with your family?" Marcus closed his book carefully, placing his finger between the pages to mark his place. He had encountered this kind of assumption before, though never quite so directly. His response was measured, polite, and firm. "No, sir, I'm in the right seat. 2B, first class." Cunningham's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "You're traveling alone? In first class?" He glanced around the cabin as if seeking support from other passengers, most of whom were pointedly avoiding eye contact. That's quite unusual for someone your age. I travel alone frequently, Marcus replied with the quiet dignity his mother had modeled for him countless times. My seat assignment is correct. The flight attendant approached, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and the practiced smile of someone who had dealt with countless passenger disputes. Her name tag read Jennifer Walsh, and she moved with the efficient grace of a veteran crew member. "Is everything all right here, gentlemen?" Cunningham turned to her with the relief of someone finally finding an authority figure. "There seems to be some mix-up with this young man's seat assignment. I'm concerned he might be lost or confused about where he should be sitting." Jennifer glanced at Marcus, then at the boarding pass he quietly held up. She scanned it with her handheld device, and her screen showed exactly what Marcus had known it would: a valid first-class ticket, properly paid for, with no irregularities. "His ticket is valid, sir. Is there an issue with your own seat assignment?" Cunningham's face flushed slightly. "My seat is fine. I'm just concerned about airline policy regarding unaccompanied minors in premium cabins. Surely there are regulations about where children should sit." "Unaccompanied minors can travel in any cabin their ticket designates, as long as the fare has been properly paid, which it has." Marcus watched this exchange with the patient attention of someone far older than his 12 years. He had learned early that sometimes adults needed to work through their discomfort with its presence before they could accept that he belonged in spaces they had assumed were exclusively theirs. His mother had taught him that dignity meant not arguing when he was right, but also not backing down when he was being treated unfairly. "Well, I find it highly irregular," Cunningham muttered, but he moved toward his own seat. As he passed Marcus, he leaned down slightly and lowered his voice. "Boy, you need to move to the back where you belong. This isn't the place for your kind." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned to stare openly. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with moments like these, but his expression remained calm. He had been preparing for this conversation his entire life, though he had never expected it to happen at 30,000 feet. "My ticket says 2B, Marcus replied quietly. "This is where I belong." Cunningham settled into his seat with obvious displeasure, muttering under his breath about declining standards and special privileges. Behind him, a woman in her 70s shook her head in disapproval, though whether her disapproval was directed at Cunningham or Marcus remained unclear. The passenger in 1A, a businessman, absorbed in his laptop, seemed determined to pretend the entire interaction hadn't occurred. Jennifer returned to check on Marcus, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. "Are you all right, sweetheart? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine, thank you. Just reading about stellar formation." She glanced at the title, surprised. "You're interested in astronomy?" "Yes, ma'am. I want to be an astrophysicist." He said it with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been told his dreams were too big. "I'm going to Los Angeles for the National Young Astronomers Program." Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "That's quite an achievement. Congratulations." As she moved away, Marcus returned to his book, but the words seemed to blur slightly on the page. He was accustomed to being the only black child in advanced programs, the only one in honors classes, the only one at academic competitions. But Cunningham's words carried a particular venom that was harder to dismiss than the usual microaggressions he had learned to navigate. The plane began to fill with the remaining passengers, and Marcus noticed several people glancing in his direction as they passed. Some looks were curious, others sympathetic, and a few carried the same disapproving energy that radiated from Cunningham. He had learned to read these expressions like weather patterns, predicting which interactions would be neutral and which might require his careful navigation. A young mother with 2 small children paused beside his seat, struggling with carry-on bags while her toddler fussed in her arms. Without hesitation, Marcus stood and helped her lift her bag into the overhead compartment. She thanked him warmly, her smile genuine and grateful. The small interaction felt like a balm after Cunningham's hostility. "What a polite young man," she said to her husband, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You don't see manners like that very often anymore." Cunningham snorted from his seat behind them, probably trying to make a good impression so no one asked questions about how he afforded that ticket. The mother's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "Nothing," Cunningham replied, suddenly interested in the safety card from his seat pocket. "Just making an observation." Marcus settled back into his seat, his book open, but his attention now divided between the text and the undercurrent of tension that had settled over this section of the cabin. He had faced skepticism about his achievements before, had endured whispered questions about affirmative action and special treatment, but Cunningham's combination of racial animus and class condescension felt particularly toxic. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their pending departure and estimated flight time to Los Angeles. Marcus checked his watch and calculated that his mother's connecting flight from New York should be boarding about now. She had promised to meet him at LAX, and he found himself looking forward to that reunion more than he had anticipated when the day began. As the cabin crew performed their safety demonstration, Marcus noticed Jennifer glancing in his direction more frequently than professional duty required. He appreciated her concern, but hoped it wouldn't become another source of attention. All he wanted was to read his book, maybe sleep for a few hours, and arrive in Los Angeles ready for 3 days of workshops with some of the country's leading astronomers. The plane pushed back from the gate with the gentle lurch that Marcus had long since grown accustomed to. Through his window, he watched the ground crew wave their final salutes as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Soon they would be airborne, and perhaps the tension in the cabin would dissipate with the Chicago skyline falling away below them. But as they waited in the takeoff queue, Cunningham's voice carried over the engine noise once again. This time, he was speaking to the passenger across the aisle, his tone conversational, but his words clearly intended for Marcus to overhear.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You have to wonder how these people afford first-class tickets," he said with false casualness. "I work 60 hours a week to earn my seat up here, and then you see situations like this that just don't add up." Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, drawing on every lesson in dignity and restraint his mother had ever taught him. In a few hours, this would all be over. But first, he had to endure whatever else Cunningham had planned for the journey ahead. The Boeing 777 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet with the smooth efficiency that Marcus had come to associate with professional aviation. The captain's voice filled the cabin with routine announcements about weather conditions and estimated arrival time, but the atmosphere in first class remained charged with an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with turbulence. Marcus attempted to return his attention to his astronomy book, but Cunningham's presence seemed to radiate hostility from the seat directly behind him. Every few minutes, he could hear the older man's voice carrying on conversations with other passengers, each exchange seeming to circle back to pointed observations about declining standards and inappropriate behavior. "The problem with society today," Cunningham was saying to the businessman in 4A, his voice pitched just loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly, "is that nobody wants to earn their place anymore. Everything gets handed out based on quotas and sympathy rather than merit." The businessman, Dr. Michael Chin, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As a pediatric surgeon who had faced his own share of discrimination throughout his career, he recognized the coded language Cunningham was employing. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning," he replied carefully. "Oh, come on," Cunningham pressed, leaning forward in the seat. "Look around this cabin. You see situations that just don't add up. A kid that age traveling alone in first class? Someone's gaming the system, and honest people like us end up paying for it." Dr. Chen glanced toward Marcus, who was determinedly focused on his book despite the obvious tension. "The boy seems well-behaved and appropriately dressed. I'm not sure what your concern is." "My concern," Cunningham's voice rose slightly, "is that we're being taken for fools. That kid didn't pay for that ticket with his allowance money. Someone's working an angle, probably insurance fraud or one of those sob story charity cases that the airlines use for publicity." Several passengers were now listening openly to the conversation. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a retired teacher in her 70s, occupying seat 1B, turned around with a stern expression that had silenced countless unruly students over the years. "Excuse me," she said with the crisp authority of someone unaccustomed to being ignored, "but your speculation about a child's travel arrangements is both inappropriate and unkind. That young man has been nothing but polite since he boarded." Cunningham's face reddened slightly, but rather than backing down, he seemed energized by the attention. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern for the boy, but adults need to ask hard questions when things don't seem right. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen a situation quite like this." "What exactly makes this situation unusual?" Dr. Chen interjected, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when dealing with difficult colleagues. "The child has a valid ticket, he's well-behaved, and he's clearly intelligent. What more qualification does he need to occupy his assigned seat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus looked around the cabin, seeming to realize that his fellow passengers were not providing the support he had expected. Instead of backing down, however, he decided to make his position even more explicit. "Let's be honest about what we're all thinking," he said, lowering his voice to what he apparently believed was a confidential tone. "That boy doesn't belong in this section. He belongs in the back with his own kind. I'm not saying it to be mean. I'm saying it because there's a natural order to things, and when that order gets disrupted, everyone suffers." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt his hands tighten around his book, but he forced himself to remain still. He had encountered racism before, but never quite so blatant and public. His mother had prepared him for moments like this, teaching him that his response would define not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. Mrs. Patterson was the first to break the silence. "Young man," she said, directing her voice toward Marcus, "would you mind switching seats with me? I think you might prefer to sit closer to the front of the cabin." It was a kind gesture, but Marcus recognized it for what it was, an attempt to diffuse the situation by accommodating Cunningham's prejudice. He turned in his seat to face her with a polite smile. "Thank you for the offer, Mrs. Patterson, but I'm comfortable where I am." Jennifer Walsh had been monitoring the situation from the galley, and she now approached with a determined stride of someone prepared to exercise her authority. As the senior flight attendant on this route, she had dealt with countless passenger disputes, but the racial overtones of this particular conflict required careful handling. "Mr. Cunningham, I need to speak with you about maintaining appropriate behavior during the flight."
Cunningham looked up with the expression of someone who believed he was being persecuted for speaking obvious truths. "What exactly have I done wrong? I haven't raised my voice, I haven't used profanity, and I haven't touched anyone. I'm simply expressing concerns about airline policy." "Your concerns," Jennifer replied carefully, "are creating a disruptive environment for other passengers. I need you to keep your opinions about other travelers to yourself for the remainder of the flight." "So now having opinions is disruptive?" Cunningham's voice began to rise. "I pay good money for these tickets, and I have a right to express my thoughts about the standards being maintained in this cabin." Dr. Chen leaned forward from his seat. "Sir, the only disruption I've noticed is your repeated commentary about a child who has done nothing to bother anyone. Perhaps you could focus on your own travel experience rather than policing others." Cunningham turned toward Dr. Chen with a sneer. "Oh, I see what this is. You people always stick together, don't you? Well, let me tell you something, doctor, if that's what you really are. I've worked hard my entire life to afford the privileges that come with first-class travel, and I won't be lectured by someone who probably got his position through affirmative action." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Dr. Chen, who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School and completed his residency at Johns Hopkins, felt the familiar sting of having his accomplishments attributed to his race rather than his abilities. But before he could respond, Marcus surprised everyone by standing up and turning to face Cunningham directly. "Sir," Marcus said with a clarity that seemed far beyond his 12 years, "I don't know what experiences have made you believe that people who look like me don't deserve the same treatment you expect for yourself, but I want you to know that your words can't change the fact that I have every right to be exactly where I am." The entire first-class cabin had gone silent. Other passengers craned their necks to witness this confrontation between a child and a grown man whose face was now flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Don't you dare lecture me, boy," Cunningham snapped, his voice dropping the pretense of civil discourse. "You have no idea what the real world is like or how hard people like me have to work to earn what we have. You're sitting in that seat because someone felt sorry for you, not because you deserve it." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity about who he was and what he represented in this moment. His voice remained calm, but it carried a strength that made several passengers lean forward to hear him better. "Mr. Cunningham, I'm sitting in this seat because my ticket says 2B. I earned this seat the same way you earned yours. Someone paid for it. The difference is that you seem to believe your payment is more valid than mine, based on nothing more than the color of my skin." Jennifer realized the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage quietly. She pressed the call button that would summon additional crew members and potentially alert the captain to a developing incident. In the galley, flight attendant David Rodriguez received the signal and began moving toward first class with the practiced urgency of someone trained in de-escalation procedures. "This is ridiculous," Cunningham declared, standing up from his seat. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by a child who thinks he can play the race card to get out of an honest conversation about merit and standards." "Sit down, sir," Jennifer commanded with newfound authority. "You're creating a disturbance that could result in your removal from this aircraft upon landing." The threat seemed to penetrate Cunningham's anger, and he reluctantly returned to his seat, but his voice carried clearly through the cabin as he muttered, 20 years of flying, and now I have to put up with lectures from children and threats from flight attendants who are more worried about political correctness than passenger comfort." Marcus remained standing for a moment longer, looking around the cabin at the faces of his fellow passengers. Some showed sympathy, others discomfort, and a few appeared to share Cunningham's sentiments while lacking the willingness to voice them publicly. He realized that this moment had become about more than just his right to occupy seat 2B. It had become a test of what kind of community these strangers would choose to create at 35,000 feet. "I'm going to return to my book now," Marcus announced calmly. "I hope the rest of our flight can be peaceful for everyone." As he settled back into his seat, Mrs. Patterson reached across the aisle and gently patted his shoulder. "You handled that beautifully, young man. Your parents should be very proud." Marcus smiled at her, grateful for the support, but also aware that the confrontation had fundamentally changed the atmosphere in the cabin. Cunningham might have been temporarily silenced, but the underlying tensions he had exposed were not so easily resolved. As the plane continued its journey westward, Marcus found himself wondering what his mother would say when he told her about this incident. Behind him, Cunningham sat in sullen silence, but Marcus could feel the weight of the man's resentment like a physical presence. The flight to Los Angeles suddenly seemed much longer than the scheduled 5 hours and 37 minutes. 2 hours into the flight, the tension in first class had settled into an uneasy truce. Cunningham sat rigidly in his seat, occasionally muttering under his breath while scrolling through his phone. Marcus had returned to his astronomy book, though his concentration remained fractured by the awareness that hostile eyes periodically fixed on the back of his head. The other passengers had largely retreated into their own private bubbles, creating an atmosphere of studied normalcy that fooled no one. Flight attendant Jennifer Walsh moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but her usual smile seemed strained. She had reported the incident to Captain Bradley Harrison in the cockpit, who had instructed her to monitor the situation closely and document any further disruptions. The last thing anyone wanted was a viral video of passenger conflict at 35,000 feet, especially one involving racial tensions and a minor. Marcus pulled out his tablet and opened the email app to check for messages from his mother.
Diana Thompson was supposed to be flying from New York to Los Angeles on a different airline, and they had planned to meet at LAX. He found a message sent just before takeoff that made him pause and read twice. "My darling Marcus, I hope your flight is peaceful and educational. I've had a change of plans and will be arriving in Los Angeles earlier than expected. Can't wait to hear about your conversations with the other passengers. Remember what we've discussed about maintaining dignity in all circumstances. You are exactly where you belong. Love, Mom. P.S. Say hello to Captain Harrison for me when you see him." Marcus frowned at the message. How would his mother know the captain's name? And why would she expect him to see the captain during a routine flight? Before he could puzzle over these details further, his attention was drawn to a commotion in the galley area. David Rodriguez, the second flight attendant, was speaking in hushed but urgent tones into the aircraft's communication system. He couldn't make out the words, but the attendant's body language suggested he was receiving instructions that surprised him. Jennifer appeared moments later, her expression tight with something that looked like barely controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer's voice came over the cabin intercom, "we've received word that we'll be making a brief, unscheduled stop in Denver for operational reasons. We apologize for any inconvenience and will have you back in the air as quickly as possible." Passengers throughout the cabin began expressing confusion and frustration. Cunningham was among the loudest complainers, demanding to know why he hadn't been notified of potential delays when he booked his ticket. Dr. Chen checked his watch and calculated whether the delay would impact his evening surgery schedule. Mrs. Patterson simply shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had learned that travel rarely proceeded exactly as planned. Marcus, however, felt a strange flutter of anticipation in his chest. Something about the announcement didn't feel routine. The crew's behavior had shifted in a way that suggested this wasn't a standard operational issue. He thought again about his mother's cryptic message and wondered if there was a connection he wasn't seeing. As the plane began its descent toward Denver International Airport, Jennifer Walsh received another message through her earpiece. This one made her close her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for whatever was coming next. She walked purposefully toward Marcus's seat, her professional mask firmly in place. "Marcus, I need to let you know that we'll be meeting some additional passengers when we land in Denver. Your mother wanted me to tell you that plans have changed slightly, but everything is proceeding exactly as it should." Marcus looked up from his tablet with genuine confusion. "My mother spoke with you? When?" Jennifer's smile became more genuine, though tinged with something that might have been awe. "Let's just say that your family has more influence over airline operations than most passengers realize. You might want to prepare yourself for some interesting developments." Behind them, Cunningham had been eavesdropping with the shameless attention of someone convinced that his suspicions were about to be validated. "I knew it," he said loud enough for most of the first class to hear. "I knew there was something fishy about this whole situation. The kid's family probably has some kind of scam going with the airline." Dr. Chen turned in his seat with obvious irritation. "Sir, could you please keep your conspiracy theories to yourself? Some of us are trying to work." "Conspiracy theories?" Cunningham's voice rose. "The flight attendant just admitted that his family has special influence over airline operations. What does that sound like to you?" Mrs. Patterson had been watching this exchange with the sharp attention of someone trained to read classroom dynamics. "It sounds to me," she said with crisp authority, "like a young man's family has the resources and connections to ensure his safety and comfort during travel, which is exactly what any good parent would do if they were able." The plane touched down at Denver International Airport with the smooth precision that Marcus had come to expect from commercial aviation. As they taxied toward the gate, he noticed an unusual amount of ground activity outside his window. Several black SUVs were positioned near the terminal, along with what appeared to be airport security personnel and individuals in expensive business attire who didn't look like typical ground crew. Jennifer Walsh received another message through her earpiece, and this time her reaction was an unmistakable surprise, followed by something approaching reverence. She approached Marcus with a demeanor that had shifted from professional courtesy to something much more deferential. "Marcus, your mother will be boarding the aircraft in just a few minutes. She wanted me to tell you that she's looking forward to meeting Captain Harrison and discussing the flight conditions with him personally."
Cunningham's eyes widened with the satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. "Oh, this is rich. Mommy's coming to rescue her little boy. I can't wait to see what kind of sob story she's prepared to explain why her kid deserves special treatment." Several passengers had begun to take notice of the unusual activity outside the aircraft. Through the windows, they could see a small convoy of vehicles approaching the plane, led by what appeared to be airport officials and security personnel. The level of coordination suggested this was not a routine passenger transfer. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, though whether from excitement or anxiety he couldn't say. His mother had always been a powerful presence in his life, but he had never seen her command this kind of operational attention from an airline. Whatever was happening was clearly beyond the scope of normal travel arrangements. The aircraft door opened with its characteristic pneumatic hiss, and the jet bridge extended to connect with the plane. But instead of passengers disembarking, the first person to enter the cabin was a man in an expensive suit who appeared to be an airline executive. He spoke briefly with Jennifer Walsh, who nodded repeatedly and glanced toward Marcus with an expression of newfound respect. Behind the executive came Captain Harrison himself, which was highly unusual for a routine stopover. The captain surveyed the first-class cabin with the practiced eye of someone assessing a situation that had moved beyond normal parameters. When his gaze fell on Marcus, his expression shifted to what might have been recognition mixed with concern. "Good afternoon, Marcus," Captain Harrison said with formal politeness. "I trust your flight has been comfortable so far." The question was clearly loaded with meaning that escaped most of the passengers, but Cunningham seized on it immediately. "Since when do captains personally greet individual passengers?" he demanded. "What kind of special treatment is this kid getting?" Captain Harrison turned toward Cunningham with the measured gaze of someone accustomed to command authority. "Sir, I'll need you to remain seated while we handle some operational matters. This won't take long." The captain's tone carried an implicit warning that even Cunningham seemed to recognize. He settled back into his seat with obvious reluctance, but his eyes remained fixed on the developing situation with the intensity of someone watching a conspiracy unfold in real time. The airline executive approached Marcus directly, extending his hand with a deference that seemed remarkable given the 12-year age difference. "Marcus Thompson? I'm Richard Sterling, Regional Operations Director for Transcontinental Airways. Your mother asked me to personally ensure that your flight experience meets the highest possible standards." Marcus shook the man's hand with the polite composure his mother had taught him, but his mind was racing with questions. How did his mother know the Regional Operations Director, and why was this level of corporate attention being directed toward a routine flight? "She also wanted me to address any concerns that might have arisen during your flight," Sterling continued, his gaze shifting meaningfully toward Cunningham. "We take passenger comfort and dignity very seriously, and we want to ensure that all travelers feel welcome in our cabins." The implications of this statement were not lost on anyone in first class. Cunningham's face had begun to turn an alarming shade of red, while other passengers watched with the fascinated attention of people witnessing something unprecedented. And then, through the aircraft door, came a presence that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the cabin. Diana Thompson entered the plane with the kind of quiet authority that made executives scramble and captains stand straighter. She wore impeccably dressed in a charcoal business suit, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. But what struck Marcus most was not her commanding presence, but the way every airline employee in sight seemed to defer to her with a reverence that suggested her influence extended far beyond normal passenger relations. Whatever her mother's true position in the world might be, it was clearly much more significant than he had ever imagined. Diana Thompson entered the first-class cabin with the measured stride of someone who had walked into countless boardrooms, knowing she owned them. Her presence immediately commanded attention, not through volume or theatrics, but through an unmistakable aura of authority that made even seasoned airline executives adjust their posture. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with minimal jewelry, her natural hair elegantly styled, and carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Good afternoon," she said to the cabin at large, her voice carrying the kind of refined authority that suggested both education and power. "I apologize for the unexpected stop, but there were some operational matters that required immediate attention." Marcus stood from his seat, uncertainty flickering across his face. While he had always known his mother was successful, the deference shown by Captain Harrison and Regional Director Sterling suggested a level of influence he had never fully grasped. "Mom, what's going on?" Diana moved to her son with the natural grace of someone comfortable in any environment, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I heard there were some concerns about passenger comfort on this flight, sweetheart. I thought it might be helpful to address them directly." Her eyes swept the cabin, taking in each passenger with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to reading people and situations quickly. When her gaze lingered on Cunningham, who sat frozen in his seat with an expression somewhere between defiance and growing apprehension, her smile became something sharper.
"Mr. Cunningham," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin with perfect clarity, "I believe you and my son have been having some interesting conversations about airline seating policies." Cunningham's face went through several rapid color changes as the implications of the situation began to dawn on him. We were just discussing passenger standards and appropriate behavior," he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating under her direct attention. "Standards," Diana repeated thoughtfully, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I imagine you have quite a lot to say about standards." She turned to Regional Director Sterling. "Richard, could you please explain to Mr. Cunningham what those standards actually entail under current federal aviation regulations?" Sterling cleared his throat, consulting a tablet that had appeared in his hands. "Certainly, Miss Thompson. Federal law prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or disability in any airline service. This includes seating assignments, cabin access, and general treatment of passengers." Diana nodded approvingly. "And what are the consequences for passengers who violate these standards by harassing other travelers?" "Passengers can be removed from flights, banned from future travel, and, in severe cases, face federal charges for interfering with flight operations," Sterling replied, his voice carrying the weight of official policy. Cunningham had begun to sweat, despite the cabin's air conditioning. "Now wait just a minute. I never harassed anyone. I simply expressed some concerns about a situation that seemed irregular." Dr. Chen, who had been listening to this exchange with growing fascination, decided to contribute his own perspective. "Sir, you told a 12-year-old boy that he needed to move to the back where he belonged, with his kind. In what universe is that not harassment?" The words hung in the air like an indictment. Several passengers who had been trying to remain neutral in the conflict now looked at Cunningham with obvious disapproval. Mrs. Patterson shook her head with the disappointed expression she had once reserved for students who had revealed their worst character traits. Diana's expression remained perfectly composed, but something in her posture suggested a predator evaluating its prey. "Mr. Cunningham, I'm curious about your background. What line of work are you in?" "I'm a regional sales manager for Hartwell Industries," Cunningham replied, clearly hoping that his corporate affiliation might provide some protection. "Hartwell Industries," Diana mused. "They manufacture automotive components, don't they? I believe they're headquartered in Detroit with facilities across the Midwest." Cunningham nodded, though he was beginning to look like a man who sensed a trap closing around him. "Yes, that's correct. I've been with the company for 18 years. Diana pulled out her phone and made a brief call, speaking so quietly that only those in the immediate vicinity could hear her words.
When she finished, she returned her attention to Cunningham with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "I've just had an interesting conversation with Jonathan Hartwell, your company's CEO. It seems Hartwell Industries has been trying to secure a significant contract with Thompson Aerospace for their new electric vehicle initiative. Jonathan was quite surprised to learn that one of his employees was publicly expressing racist views while representing his company on a commercial flight." The color drained from Cunningham's face as the full implications of his situation became clear. Thompson Aerospace, he recognized the name now, one of the largest defense and commercial aerospace contractors in the country. The woman standing before him wasn't just some angry parent. She was Diana Thompson, CEO of a company that could make or break businesses with a single contract decision. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice now stripped of all its earlier bravado, "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about my comments. I certainly never intended any disrespect toward your son." "Oh, but you did intend disrespect. You intended to humiliate a child because his presence in first class challenged your assumptions about who deserves comfort and dignity. You told my son he belonged in the back with his kind, not because of anything he had done, but because of the color of his skin." Captain Harrison, who had been observing this exchange with professional interest, stepped forward. "Miss Thompson, how would you like us to proceed? We can remove Mr. Cunningham from the flight and arrange alternative transportation." Diana considered this for a moment, her gaze never leaving Cunningham's increasingly pale face. "That won't be necessary, Captain. Mr. Cunningham is going to complete this flight so he can reflect on his behavior and its consequences. But I think some education might be in order." She turns to address the entire first-class cabin, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing boardrooms and congressional committees. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share something that might be illuminating. My company, Thompson Aerospace, employs over 50,000 people across 12 states. We generate approximately $14 billion in annual revenue and hold contracts with every major airline in the United States." The passengers listened with rapt attention, many of them now recognizing the name and understanding the scope of her influence. "We also happen to own a significant equity stake in Transcontinental Airways," Diana continued, her eyes fixed on Cunningham. "Which means that when passengers on our aircraft experience discrimination, it becomes both a personal and a business concern for me." Regional Director Sterling stepped forward with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Miss Thompson, I want to assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated and addressed according to our strongest disciplinary measures." "I appreciate that, Richard," Diana replied smoothly, "but I think this situation calls for something more comprehensive than internal discipline. I want to see systematic changes that ensure no child ever has to endure what my son experienced today." She opened her briefcase and removed a folder thick with documents. "I've prepared a comprehensive review of Transcontinental Airways passenger treatment protocols, training procedures, and incident response systems. I think you'll find my recommendations quite detailed." Cunningham sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation fully penetrated. He had not only humiliated himself publicly, but had also potentially destroyed his career by targeting the son of one of the most powerful women in American aerospace. The irony was not lost on him that his assumptions about who belonged in first class had led him to attack someone with more legitimate claim to that space than he could ever hope to possess. Dr. Chen leaned forward in his seat, unable to suppress his curiosity. "Miss Thompson, may I ask how you knew to intercept this flight? How did you know what was happening?" Diana's expression softened slightly as she looked at her son. "Marcus and I have an understanding. When he travels, he sends me regular updates about his experiences. When those updates suggested he was facing hostility from a fellow passenger, I decided it was time to take a more active role in ensuring his comfort and safety. Mrs. Patterson had been watching this entire exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in power dynamics. "Young man," she said to Marcus, "your mother is quite remarkable." Marcus looked up at Diana with a mixture of pride and newfound understanding. "I'm beginning to realize that myself, Mrs. Patterson." Diana placed her hand on her son's shoulder again, her voice taking on a gentler tone. "Marcus has every right to travel in comfort and dignity, just like every other passenger on this aircraft. The fact that anyone would question that right says nothing about him and everything about the questioner." She turned back to Cunningham, who seemed to have shrunk into his seat. "Mr. Cunningham, you have a choice to make. You can use this experience to examine your assumptions and perhaps become a better person, or you can continue to harbor the prejudices that led you to this embarrassing moment. But I want you to understand that your words and actions have consequences that extend far beyond this aircraft." The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of the aircraft's systems. Outside, ground crews were preparing for departure, but inside, a different kind of reckoning was taking place, one that would reshape how everyone present thought about power, privilege, and the assumptions we make about who belongs where. Diana Thompson opened her briefcase and extracted a tablet, her movements deliberate and precise. The first-class cabin had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the steady hum of aircraft systems and the occasional rustle of fabric as passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She tapped the screen several times, accessing files that clearly contained detailed information about Transcontinental Airways operations. "Captain Harrison, I'd like to review the passenger manifest for this flight. Specifically, I want to understand how seat assignments are made and what protocols exist for addressing passenger complaints." The captain, who had commanded aircraft for over 20 years, found himself in the unprecedented position of taking operational direction from a passenger. Yet her tone and deference shown by airline executives made it clear this was not a typical passenger request. "Miss Thompson, our seating assignments are computerized and based on fare class, frequent flyer status, and special accommodation requests," he replied carefully. "And when passenger conflicts arise, flight attendants are trained to de-escalate situations while maintaining operational safety." Diana's fingers continued moving across her tablet screen as she spoke. "And what happens when de-escalation fails, when a passenger's behavior crosses the line from mere complaint to harassment based on protected characteristics?" Regional Director Sterling stepped forward nervously. "We have protocols for removing disruptive passengers and documenting incidents for potential law enforcement involvement." "I see," Diana said, finally looking up from her device. "And how often are these protocols actually implemented when the harassment involves racial targeting of minority passengers?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sterling's hesitation in answering spoke volumes about the reality of enforcement versus policy.
Dr. Chen, who had been observing this exchange with professional interest, decided to contribute. "In my experience flying for medical conferences, I've witnessed several incidents of racial harassment that were handled with, let's call it, minimal intervention." Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. "As a retired educator, I've seen far too many situations where institutions have policies on paper but lack the courage to enforce them when it matters." Diana turned her attention to the tablet again, this time projecting its contents onto the cabin's entertainment screens. The passengers could now see detailed financial documents showing ownership structures and equity positions within various transportation companies. "Thompson Aerospace Holdings," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a corporate presentation, "maintains strategic investments across the transportation sector. These investments include a 23% equity stake in Transcontinental Airways, majority ownership of Thomson Logistics, and controlling interests in 14 regional carriers." Cunningham's face had progressed through several shades of pale and was now approaching something resembling gray. The full scope of his miscalculation was becoming clearer with each revelation about Diana's corporate reach. More importantly, Diana continued, these investments come with certain expectations about corporate culture, employee training, and customer treatment standards. When those standards are not met, it becomes necessary to implement corrective measures. She gestured to Sterling, who produced his own tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Effective immediately, Transcontinental Airways will implement the Thompson Protocol for passenger dignity. This includes mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, real-time incident reporting systems, and quarterly audits of passenger treatment data. The scope of the changes was staggering. Diana wasn't just addressing the immediate incident. She was restructuring airline operations to prevent future occurrences across the entire fleet. The Thompson Protocol, Diana explained, requires that any passenger complaint involving potential discrimination be escalated immediately to management level, documented thoroughly, and investigated by independent third parties. Flight crew who fail to properly address harassment will face mandatory retraining or termination. Captain Harrison absorbed this information with the stoic expression of someone whose professional world had just been fundamentally altered. Ms. Thompson, implementing these changes across our entire operation will require significant resources and training time. Resources, Diana replied smoothly, that Thomson Aerospace is prepared to provide as part of our continued investment in Transcontinental Airways. The question isn't whether we can afford to implement these changes, it's whether we can afford not to. She turned to address Cunningham directly for the first time since revealing her identity. Mr. Cunningham, you wondered earlier how a 12-year-old could afford a first-class ticket. The answer is quite simple. His mother owns part of the airline. The statement landed with devastating simplicity. Cunningham had spent hours questioning Marcus's right to occupy seat 2B, never realizing that the boy's family had literal ownership stakes in the aircraft itself. But more than that, Diana continued, you questioned his right to dignity and respect based solely on his appearance. You told him he belonged in the back with his kind, not knowing that his kind built the engines that power this aircraft, designed the safety systems that protect your life, and invested the capital that makes your travel possible. Dr. Chen leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Miss Thompson, if you don't mind me asking, how did Thomson Aerospace become involved in the airline industry? Most aerospace companies focus on manufacturing rather than operations. Diana's expression softened slightly as she shifted into what was clearly a more comfortable topic. 15 years ago, Marcus's father, my late husband, identified inefficiencies in commercial aviation that could be addressed through better integration between manufacturers and operators. We began acquiring strategic positions in airlines to implement innovations that benefit both safety and passenger experience. The mention of her late husband added a new dimension to her story that hadn't been apparent before. Marcus reached over and squeezed his mother's hand briefly, a gesture that spoke to a deeper family history than the other passengers had understood. After James passed, I inherited not just his business vision, but his commitment to creating transportation systems that serve all passengers with equal dignity. Today's incident represents exactly the kind of systemic problem we've been working to address. Mrs. Patterson had been listening to this explanation with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made in real time. Young man, she said to Marcus, you're carrying quite a legacy. Marcus looked around the cabin at the faces focused on him with newfound respect and understanding. I've always known my family was involved in aviation, but I didn't realize the extent of Mom's influence until today. Jennifer Walsh, who had been standing quietly near the galley during these revelations, stepped forward with an expression of professional concern. Miss Thompson, how would you like us to handle the remainder of this flight? We're prepared to implement any special measures you deem necessary.
Diana shook her head firmly. No special measures, Jennifer. That's exactly the point. Every passenger on this aircraft, regardless of age, race, or economic status, deserves the same level of service and respect. The only thing that should be special about this flight is that it marks the beginning of systematic change. She returned her attention to the tablet, pulling up additional documents. The Thompson Protocol includes provisions for passenger education as well as employee training. Mr. Cunningham, you're going to be our first case study. Cunningham, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout these revelations, finally found his voice. What does that mean exactly? It means, Diana replied with clinical precision, that your behavior today will be documented, analyzed, and used to develop training materials that help other passengers understand the impact of their words and actions. Your employer has already been notified, and they'll be participating in the development of corporate sensitivity programs. The comprehensive nature of the consequences was becoming clear. This wasn't just about punishment for bad behavior. It was about creating systematic change that would prevent similar incidents across multiple industries and companies. Regional Director Sterling cleared his throat nervously. Miss Thompson, the board of directors will want to review these protocol changes in detail. The implementation timeline you're suggesting is quite aggressive. Diana's smile carried the confidence of someone who had anticipated this objection. Richard, I've already spoken with board chair Elizabeth Hawthorne. The Thompson Protocol has been approved for immediate implementation across all transcontinental airways operations. The board recognizes that passenger dignity isn't a negotiable commodity. The revelation that she had already secured board approval demonstrated a level of corporate maneuvering that left even experienced business travelers impressed. She hadn't simply reacted to her son's treatment. She had orchestrated a comprehensive response that would reshape industry standards. Captain Harrison made one final attempt to understand his new reality. Miss Thompson, in practical terms, how will these changes affect day-to-day flight operations? They'll make your job easier, Captain, Diana replied confidently. When passengers understand that harassment has immediate and serious consequences, when employees are properly trained to recognize and address discrimination, and when corporate culture actively supports dignity for all travelers, you'll find that most conflicts resolve themselves before they require your intervention. As the aircraft prepared for departure from Denver, the transformation of the cabin's social dynamics was complete. Cunningham sat in humiliated silence. Other passengers regarded Marcus and his mother with obvious respect, and the airline staff operated with a new understanding of accountability and standards. The flight to Los Angeles would continue, but nothing about commercial aviation would ever be quite the same. 3 months after the incident on Flight 847, the ripple effects of Diana Thompson's intervention had spread far beyond a single aircraft cabin. In corporate boardrooms across the aviation industry, executives found themselves implementing policies they had never considered necessary, driven by competitive pressure and the quiet influence of Thomson Aerospace's expanding portfolio. At Transcontinental Airways headquarters in Atlanta, the transformation was most visible in the newly constructed Thomson Center for Aviation Excellence. The facility housed state-of-the-art training simulators, diversity education classrooms, and a passenger experience laboratory where employees practiced handling complex interpersonal situations. Regional Director Sterling, who had survived the corporate restructuring following Flight 847, now served as Director of Passenger Relations and had become an unlikely champion of the changes. Before the Thompson Protocol, Sterling explained to a group of airline executives from competing carriers, "Our response to passenger conflicts was reactive and inconsistent. We waited for problems to escalate before intervening, and our solutions focused on immediate de-escalation rather than addressing underlying issues." The audience, representing 12 major airlines, listened with the attention of professionals who understood that industry standards were shifting rapidly. Diana Thompson's influence extended beyond her direct investments. Her approach to passenger dignity had become a competitive advantage that forced other carriers to adapt or risk losing market share to more progressive competitors. In the training center's main classroom,
flight attendant Jennifer Walsh was conducting her third session of the week on recognizing and responding to discriminatory passenger behavior. Her curriculum had been developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and psychology professionals, creating a comprehensive approach that addressed both explicit harassment and subtle microaggressions. The key insight from the Flight 847 incident was that discrimination often begins with assumptions about who belongs in premium spaces. By the time verbal harassment occurs, multiple intervention opportunities have already been missed. One of the trainees, a young flight attendant named Sarah Chen, raised her hand. How do we distinguish between legitimate operational concerns and discriminatory targeting? Sometimes passengers do have invalid tickets or documentation issues. Walsh nodded approvingly at the question. The difference lies in the verification process. In the Flight 847 case, the passenger's ticket was never properly scanned or verified. The assumptions came first and the questioning followed. Proper protocol requires documentation review before any passenger is approached about seating irregularities.
Meanwhile, in Detroit, Hartwell Industries was experiencing its own transformation. CEO Jonathan Hartwell had not only terminated Robert Cunningham, but had also implemented company-wide diversity training and established partnerships with minority-owned suppliers as part of their ongoing effort to secure contracts with Thomson Aerospace. The incident had become a catalyst for examining corporate culture across the automotive supply chain. We learned that the behavior of our employees reflects on our corporate values, even when they're not officially representing the company, Hartwell explained during a quarterly earnings call. The Thomson Aerospace partnership has challenged us to align our internal culture with our stated commitment to diversity and inclusion. The financial implications of this cultural shift were significant. Hartwell Industries had not only secured the Thomson Aerospace contract, but it also attracted new business from other companies seeking suppliers with demonstrated commitments to social responsibility. Cunningham's discriminatory behavior, ironically, had led to positive changes that benefited the company financially as well as ethically. At Thomson Aerospace's Los Angeles headquarters, Diana maintained a monitoring system that tracked passenger treatment data across all airlines in which her company held investments. The data revealed patterns that confirmed her suspicions about systemic discrimination in commercial aviation. The statistics are sobering, Diana explained to Marcus as they reviewed the quarterly reports together. Before implementing the Thomson Protocol, incidents of racial harassment were documented in less than 30% of cases. Most were dismissed as personality conflicts or misunderstandings. Marcus, now 13 and increasingly involved in his mother's advocacy work, studied the charts with the analytical skills he had inherited from both parents. What about the airlines that haven't adopted the protocol? Are they seeing different patterns? Very different, Diana replied. Carriers without standardized anti-discrimination policies show incident rates 3 times higher than Thomson Protocol airlines. More importantly, passenger satisfaction scores directly correlate with dignity protection measures. The business case for treating passengers equitably had become undeniable. Airlines implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination training saw improvements in customer loyalty, reduced legal liability, and enhanced corporate reputations that translated into measurable revenue increases. Dr. Michael Chen, the pediatric surgeon who had witnessed the original incident, found himself unexpectedly involved in the broader transformation. His expertise in crisis management and communication had made him a valuable consultant for airlines developing passenger conflict resolution protocols. The medical field has spent decades learning to address unconscious bias in patient care, he explained during a consultation with Southwest Airlines executives. The same principles apply to passenger service. When we assume that someone doesn't belong in a particular space, we create barriers to providing appropriate care or service. His work with airlines had revealed disturbing parallels between healthcare disparities and transportation discrimination. Minority passengers faced longer wait times, more aggressive questioning of their credentials, and reduced access to premium services even when they had paid for equal treatment. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the retired teacher who had supported Marcus during the flight, had become an unlikely advocate for aviation reform. Her background in education made her particularly effective at explaining how discriminatory attitudes developed and could be addressed through proper training. Children learn these biases from observing adult behavior, she told a congressional subcommittee examining discrimination in transportation. When a 12-year-old boy handles racial harassment with more dignity than the adults around him, we have to ask serious questions about our educational and social systems. Her testimony had contributed to federal legislation requiring anti-discrimination training for all transportation employees, expanding protections beyond the aviation industry to include rail, bus, and ride-sharing services. The ripple effects extended into the technology sector as well. Thomson Aerospace had partnered with software companies to develop artificial intelligence systems that could identify patterns of discriminatory treatment in customer service interactions. These systems analyzed everything from response times to language patterns, providing objective data about potential bias in service delivery. The beauty of data-driven bias detection, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, Thomson Aerospace's Chief Technology Officer, is that it removes the subjectivity from discrimination claims. When we can show that passengers with certain names or appearances consistently receive different treatment, it becomes much harder to dismiss incidents as isolated misunderstandings. The technology had applications far beyond aviation. Retail companies, hotels, and financial institutions were implementing similar systems to ensure equitable treatment of all customers. The Flight 847 incident had inadvertently sparked a technological revolution in bias detection and prevention. In educational institutions across the country, the Thomson case study had become required reading in business ethics and organizational behavior courses. Students analyzed the decision-making processes that led to both the discrimination and the systematic response, learning valuable lessons about corporate responsibility and leadership. Professor Janet Williams at Stanford Business School used the case to illustrate how individual incidents could catalyze industry-wide change. Diana Thompson didn't just address her son's mistreatment, she explained to her students. She used her position and resources to create systems that would protect other children from similar experiences. The academic analysis revealed important insights about effective advocacy. Thompson's success came from her ability to combine emotional motivation with strategic thinking, leveraging corporate power to create sustainable change rather than simply seeking personal satisfaction or revenge. At the National Young Astronomers Program, Marcus had become something of a celebrity among his peers. His experience on Flight 847 had been documented in case studies and news articles, making him a recognizable figure in discussions about youth advocacy and social justice. The weird thing, Marcus told his fellow program participants, is that I never wanted to be famous for facing discrimination. I wanted to be known for my research on stellar formation patterns. His mentor, Dr. Sarah Kim, helped him understand the broader implications of his experience. Sometimes leadership finds us rather than the other way around. Your mother showed you how to use privilege and power responsibly, and now you have the opportunity to influence how your generation approaches these issues. The transformation sparked by Flight 847 had fundamentally altered the landscape of commercial aviation and beyond. What began as one man's prejudice against a 12-year-old boy had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of how institutions could address discrimination proactively rather than reactively. Industry analysts estimated that the Thomson Protocol and similar initiatives had prevented thousands of discrimination incidents across multiple transportation sectors. More importantly, they had created a new standard for corporate accountability that extended far beyond the specific companies directly involved in the original incident. The success of the systematic approach had attracted international attention as well. European and Asian airlines began implementing similar protocols, recognizing that passenger dignity was becoming a global competitive advantage in the transportation industry. 5 years had passed since Flight 847, and Marcus Thompson stood at the podium of the International Conference on Transportation Equity, now 17 years old and preparing to address an audience of airline executives, civil rights advocates from around the world. The shy 12-year-old who had once quietly endured racial harassment in seat 2B had evolved into a confident young leader whose voice carried the weight of lived experience and institutional change. "When I was 12, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. A man told me I belonged in the back of the plane with my kind. He never imagined that his prejudice would reshape an entire industry, or that the boy he tried to diminish would grow up to help design the systems that now protect millions of travelers." The audience, representing 43 countries and every major transportation company in North America, listened with the attention reserved for speakers whose words carried both personal truth and professional relevance. Marcus had become more than a symbol of discrimination overcome. He was now a recognized expert in organizational psychology and bias prevention, despite his youth. Behind him, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. Documented incidents of racial harassment in commercial aviation had decreased by 78% across Thomson Protocol carriers. Customer satisfaction scores had reached historic highs. Most remarkably, the economic benefits of dignified passenger treatment had convinced even the most profit-focused executives that equality was not just morally right, but financially smart. The Thomson Protocol didn't just change how airlines operate. It demonstrated that systematic discrimination is a choice, not an inevitability. When institutions decide to prioritize dignity, they discover that treating people fairly is entirely achievable. In the audience, Diana Thompson watched her son with the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed a remarkable transformation. She sat beside Dr. Michael Chen, now serving as Director of Customer Experience for a consortium of airlines, and Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose educational background had made her a sought-after consultant for transportation bias training programs. The conference had become an annual gathering that attracted international attention. Representatives from European rail systems, Asian airlines, and emerging transportation technologies came to study the American model of proactive discrimination prevention. The principles developed in response to one incident on one flight had become a global standard for customer treatment across multiple industries. Marcus clicked a remote, and the screen showed a world map dotted with indicators representing transportation systems that had adopted Thomson Protocol principles. Today, over 200 transportation companies across 6 continents use bias detection systems, mandatory dignity training, and real-time incident response protocols. What began as one mother's response to her son's mistreatment has become an international movement. The data was impressive, but Marcus understood that statistics could not capture the human impact of these changes. He thought about the countless children who would never experience what he had on Flight 847, the families who could travel without fear of harassment, and the employees who now worked within systems that supported rather than tolerated discrimination.
Dr. Amanda Foster, Thomson Aerospace's Chief Technology Officer, had spent the morning presenting the latest developments in artificial intelligence bias detection. Her systems now monitored not just airline interactions, but hotel check-ins, retail customer service, and even healthcare patient treatment. The technology had evolved far beyond its original aviation applications. The beautiful irony,
Dr. Foster explained during a breakout session, is that Robert Cunningham's prejudice catalyzed innovations that have protected millions of people from experiencing similar treatment. His moment of hatred became the foundation for systematic dignity protection. Cunningham himself had become an unexpected figure in the transformation story. After losing his position at Hartwell Industries, he had initially retreated into bitterness and resentment. But mandatory participation in restorative justice programs, combined with the financial consequences of his actions, had eventually led to genuine self-reflection. He now worked as a trainer for corporate sensitivity programs, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the costs of prejudice. His presentations were uncomfortable, but effective, showing executives exactly how quickly discriminatory behavior could destroy careers and damage companies. The man who had once embodied workplace bigotry had become an unlikely advocate for change. "I destroyed my own life because I couldn't see past my assumptions about a 12-year-old boy. The Thompson family could have simply destroyed me in return. Instead, they created systems that help people like me recognize our biases before they cause harm." His transformation was not universally celebrated. Many questioned whether his change was genuine or merely pragmatic, but even skeptics acknowledged that his willingness to publicly confront his past behavior had educational value. The conference's afternoon session focused on emerging challenges in transportation equity. As new technologies like autonomous vehicles and space tourism developed, advocates worked to ensure that discriminatory practices would not be embedded in next-generation systems. Marcus had become particularly interested in space accessibility, combining his childhood passion for astronomy with his expertise in equity advocacy. Thomson Aerospace was now developing partnerships with commercial space companies to ensure that the final frontier would be genuinely accessible rather than limited to economic elites. "Space travel represents the ultimate test of our commitment to human dignity," Marcus told the conference delegates. "If we allow discrimination to shape who gets to leave Earth, we risk carrying our worst impulses to the stars." The comment drew applause, but it also reflected the ambitious scope of the movement that had grown from Flight A47. What had begun as a response to airline discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive approach to equity across all forms of human mobility and exploration. Jennifer Walsh, now Director of Industry Standards for the International Association of Flight Attendants, had spent 5 years training crew members around the world in dignity protection protocols. Her curriculum had been adopted by aviation authorities in dozens of countries, creating global consistency in passenger treatment standards. "The most important lesson from Flight 847, Walsh said to the conference, is that bystander intervention works, but only when institutions support the people who speak up." Marcus's dignity was protected not just by his mother's power, but by passengers and crew members who refused to accept discriminatory behavior as normal. The ripple effects had extended into legislative arenas as well. The Thompson Civil Rights and Transportation Act, passed by Congress 2 years earlier, had established federal standards for bias prevention in all forms of public and commercial transportation. Similar legislation was being considered in the European Union and several Asian countries. As the conference concluded, Marcus found himself in conversation with a group of young advocates from around the world. They were implementing transportation equity programs in their own countries, adapting Thompson Protocol principles to local context and challenges. The key insight, explained Maria Santos, a Brazilian transportation engineer, is that dignity is not culturally relative. Whether you're boarding a bus in Sao Paulo or a plane in Chicago, you deserve to be treated with respect. Her comment reflected the universal applicability of lessons learned from Flight 847. Discrimination might take different forms in different contexts, but the systematic approaches to preventing it had proven remarkably transferable across cultures and transportation systems. Diana Thompson delivered the conference's closing remarks, reflecting on the journey from that difficult flight to the global movement that it had spawned.
5 years ago, my son faced hatred from a stranger who believed that skin color determined someone's worth. Today, that same son is helping design systems that protect children around the world from similar experiences. She paused, looking out at the audience of change makers and advocates. We learned that individual acts of prejudice can catalyze systematic transformation, but only when people with power choose to use it responsibly. The question facing all of us is whether we will continue to build systems that reflect our highest values or allow our lowest impulses to shape the future. The standing ovation that followed was not just appreciation for her words, but recognition of a movement that had fundamentally altered how institutions thought about human dignity. Flight 847 had lasted 5.5 hours, but its impact would continue for generations.
As delegates filed out of the conference hall, many of them carrying implementation plans for their own organizations, Marcus reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him from seat 2B to this global stage. The boy who had simply wanted to read about black holes had become a catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless future travelers. The transformation was far from complete. Discrimination persisted in many forms and contexts, but the tools and frameworks developed in response to one incident had proven that systematic change was possible when commitment met strategy. The legacy of Flight 847 would continue to unfold in ways that even Diana Thompson could not have imagined when she first boarded that plane in Denver, determined to protect her son's dignity and create a better world for all children who would follow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.